What is the most overrated thing about every UFC fighter? Paddy Pimblett. Okay, the most overrated thing about Paddy Pimblett is his striking. Yeah, he might have had a good performance against Michael Chandler. He stayed at distance. But at the end of the day, it's Michael Chandler, okay? That's not that impressive of a person to have a good striking performance against. Let's be honest, okay? It's not like he went out there and outstruck Max Holloway or Ilia Topuria. Let's keep in mind, this is a guy that fought Tony Ferguson and was getting tagged. Literally getting tagged by a washed Tony Ferguson. That wasn't that long ago, and he probably made improvements, but you can't go from his performance against Tony Ferguson on the feet to a complete top-level striker as people are kind of thinking he is. I think he definitely has made improvements, but I don't think he's anywhere near a top-level striker. I think really what carries his game is his grappling. Next, we have Alex Pereira, though, and I think it's time now to say that Alex Pereira's most overrated thing about him is his striking. After that Magomed and Goliath performance, you can't really argue against it. Like, let's be real. Yeah, it was a sort of close fight, but on the feet, I think Magomed was clearly winning. I think he has the advantage, and I get Alex Pereira, you know, has all this kickboxing background, and I think by no means Alex Pereira is still not a top striker in the UFC. I just think he's not number one or number two or number three. He's at a time in his career where he's just slowing down. He's like 38 years old. That's the big thing we saw in the Ankalaev fight is he was just slower, and Ankalaev had crisp boxing, clean technique, and he just seemed like he was able to catch Pereira off guard with his speed. I don't necessarily think people overrate his skill, but I think they overrate his ability in striking now. In the rematch against Ankalaev, I don't think he's going to be able to knock out Ankalaev or outstrike him over 5 rounds, and I think mostly because of the physical part. Arman Tsarukyan. Okay, I think the most overrated thing about Arman Tsarukyan, the most obvious overrated thing that people hype up way too much is his grappling, okay? I don't know if you guys are just running with the fact that he had a close fight with Makhachev in his debut, and I'm talking about grappling, not wrestling. Let's look at Charles Oliveira. He almost got submitted twice in that fight, and now people are saying that Arman Tsarukyan's gonna take down Ilia Topuria and finish him on the ground. I don't think there's a chance in hell that happens, and I don't think he's even very close to Islam Makhachev in grappling level. I think Makhachev's a much better grappler, and I think it's mostly the fact of the jiu-jitsu aspect. Arman Tsarukyan's a good wrestler. He can scramble well, but wrestling and grappling is not just scrambles. When you're almost getting finished by a guy like Charles Oliveira, I don't know how you can pick him to finish Topuria on the ground. I know styles make fights, but that style makes no sense, especially what we saw from Ilia Topuria. I don't think Arman's going to have much success getting a finish on the ground, let alone even taking Ilia Topuria down. And I think a lot of people think that, you know, Arman Tsarukyan's is Islam Makhachev 2.0 on the ground. No way. But now Ilia Topuria is next. And I think after this Charles Oliveira fight, people are overrating Ilia Topuria's wrestling, just his wrestling specifically. They take the fact that he was able to reverse a takedown against Charles Oliveira, and that somehow proved that no one's going to have success taking Ilia Topuria down just because of the fact that he ended up on top with Charles Oliveira. I just don't think Charles Oliveira is the ultimate test for grappling and for being a good lightweight. I think people thought Charles Oliveira would be a tougher test for Topuria than a guy like Volk or a guy like Max Holloway just because of the fact that he's a 155er. I completely reject the idea that 155 is going to be a tougher test for Topuria because they're bigger. I think that's completely bullshit, and I think that reversing a takedown against Charles Oliveira is just not that impressive. Charles has never been this dangerous wrestler. When does he take people down? What, Chandler? He took Michael Chandler down? That doesn't mean shit, especially after that fucking Paddy Pimblett win. I think if a guy like Islam Makhachev came back down to 155, Topuria would be in a lot more trouble. That's an actual wrestler who's strong and could take Topuria down, not a guy like Charles Oliveira. Yeah, Charles Oliveira is somewhat a dangerous submission threat if he hurts you or if he's on top. And that's not to say Ilia Topuria has bad wrestling. I think people just are completely delusional about the fact that Topuria has always been a good grappler, and that doing what he did against Oliveira is the thing that proved he's a good wrestler and grappler. But Islam Makhachev's next, and especially going into his next fight with JDM, I think the biggest overrated part of his games is stand-up. I really do. I hear a lot of people in the comments saying that Islam Makhachev is going to go tit for tat with JDM. If you think Islam Makhachev's going to stand and strike with JDM, you're out of your mind. JDM is a much better striker than Islam Makhachev. And especially going off of performance like Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier is a smaller fighter who has, in my opinion, worse boxing than JDM. And we saw how close that fight is. Now, what happens when Islam Makhachev fights a guy who's even bigger than him, who has more range, who's an even better striker, who probably has more power. He doesn't stand a chance on the feet in my opinion. I don't think he's going to get finished and outclassed in the first round, but I think he will easily lose on the feet if he just stands with JDM. And I think a lot of people think it's going to be even on the feet. I don't think that at all. I think if Islam Makhachev wants to win this fight, he's going to have to only wrestle. But Dricus Du Plessis next, and going into his fight with Khamzat Chimaev, I think this is clearly evident, which is the most overrated part of his game is his defensive grappling. A lot of people think that DDP is going to go in there against Khamzat, and because he's Dricus and he's bigger than Robert Whittaker and he's more durable and he has plot armor, he's going to be fine on the ground with Khamzat. I don't think he is, and I don't think Dricus has done much to prove that he's good off of his back or good when someone's on his back. He's never been put in that position that much anytime recent in his career against high-level opponents. And I think we can all agree that Khamzat is going to at least engage in a grappling exchange. But I think a lot of people have accepted that Khamzat's going to take him down. But I think people are a little too confident in DDP's ability to survive with somebody on his back or with someone on top of him, like Khamzat Chimaev. He's more durable than Robert Whittaker, and maybe he doesn't get his teeth smashed, but if he gets put in a neck crank, he's going to tap. If he gets put in a rear naked choke, he's going to get put to sleep. Yeah, he might not get ground and pound finished. He might be able to tank some shots more than a guy like Robert Whittaker or any other person Khamzat's fought, but I wouldn't be so sure that DDP can survive round one against Khamzat Chimaev. Merab Dvalishvili's next, and I'm going to be honest, the most overrated part of Merab is everything. And that's not to say Merab's a bad fighter. I think he's honestly top 3 pound for pound. But I feel like people think that Merab is this unbeatable fighter the same way Ilia Topuria is. And what I mean by that is Ilia Topuria, I don't think has a chance of losing to anybody at lightweight at all. I don't think any of the fights will end up by a close decision or anything like that. As opposed to a guy like Merab, yeah, he's one of the best fighters pound for pound ever, but I don't think he has that same level of dominance over his division. Like, let's not forget about the Umar fight. That was a close fight. Umar was not that far away from winning that fight. Like, what happens in that rematch? I wouldn't be so confident in thinking Merab just wins that fight again. He probably does, but Umar is a tough test for Merab. We saw that in their first fight. I hate when people think that Merab just dominated Umar. That's completely false. As opposed to Ilia Topuria, I don't think there's one person in the lightweight division who would put a fight up like that against Ilia Topuria. I think Arman would get finished in the first round. I think Paddy Pimblett would get finished in the first round. And I think people think Merab's a little more unbeatable than he is. But Khamzat Chimaev's next, and I've said this many times, and I'm going to say it again. The most overrated part of Khamzat's game is his cardio. It's also his biggest weakness. I hate when people don't address this. Like, they try to give every excuse under the sun for Khamzat Chimaev's gassing out, right? He gassed out in the Usman fight. He did. He really slowed down, and people say it's a broken hand. He slowed down in the Gilbert Burns fight, and they said it was a bad game plan. I just think regardless, Khamzat Chimaev's going to end up tired in any round past the second because of just the way he fights. I mean, he's like a McGregor, but a grappler version. And those excuses for his cardio might be valid, but I think regardless, that doesn't make his cardio good. And I think that's what makes the fight between Dricus and Khamzat interesting, because if DDP can survive that first round, which is a big if, the second round is going to be much harder for Khamzat, and it's going to get harder in the third, fourth, and fifth. Any round past the second round, I think most people would be heavily in favor of Dricus to win that, just because of the fact that we've seen Dricus go 5 rounds. We've never seen Khamzat go 5 rounds. And I don't think anybody's confident in Khamzat Chimaev in championship rounds. Jiri Prochazka. Okay, the most overrated thing about Jiri Prochazka is his matchup against Ankalaev. I hear a lot of people saying that Jiri is the kryptonite for Ankalaev, and I just completely disagree. I think Jiri going up against a guy like Ankalaev, who's probably quicker than Jiri, who has a decent amount of power, who's fundamentally sound, who throws straight shots quickly, is very bad for Jiri. Jiri's unorthodox. He'll throw looping shots, and I think somebody who's quick and throws straights like Ankalaev is going to catch Jiri Prochazka at some point. Going along with that, I think people overrate the improvement Jiri Prochazka's made, which is his striking defense. And I think he actually made good improvement, but I think people take it a little too far. And in that Jamal Hill fight, his defense was better, his head movement was better, but he still fights with his hands down. He does. And that's just not going to work against Ankalaev. I really think that's a bad idea if he goes in there with his hands down. And I think Ankalaev is actually a nightmare matchup for Jiri. But Justin Gaethje's next, and this is probably the one that irritates me the most, is people who think that Justin Gaethje has good defensive grappling. That's the most overrated thing about Justin Gaethje, is his defensive grappling. I don't know where you guys get the idea that Gaethje has good defensive grappling. What are you guys watching? Did you watch the Khabib fight? That was the most embarrassing performance Gaethje's ever put on. And yeah, it's Khabib. He's one of the best best grapplers of all time. But compared to like a Dustin Poirier's performance against Khabib or Conor McGregor's, Gaethje looked considerably worse than all of his other opponents. He just got straight up outclassed and submitted the moment he hit the ground. And then you look at his Fiziev fight and he's almost getting finished on the ground with Fiziev. Yeah, I think he has good takedown defense, right? He has that wrestling background. I think a lot of people just think that, just because Justin Gaethje has a wrestling background, he's good when it comes to grappling. I think Gaethje's jiu-jitsu is probably the worst out of every top contender at lightweight. And I don't know why people think that, going into a matchup against a guy like Paddy Pimblett, he's going to do well. I think Paddy Pimblett is going to beat the shit out of Justin Gaethje if that fight ever happens. I don't think it's going to happen, but Paddy Pimblett is actually a nightmare matchup for Gaethje. He's rangier, he can stay at distance, and if he gets that takedown, I think Gaethje's screwed. But Dustin Poirier is next, and this is 100% my hottest take. Dustin Poirier's most overrated part of his game is his boxing. And that's not to say Dustin Poirier is not a high-level striker or not one of the best strikers at lightweight, but the way people overrate his boxing is crazy. Some people think that Dustin Poirier is one of the best boxers in the UFC. That's so far from the truth. Let's be real. Dustin Poirier doesn't even turn his hips over when he throws a punch half the time. Okay, he needs some boxing lessons from Topuria at this point. The main reason I say it's overrated is because people put him so high. I don't think Dustin Poirier is even close to number one. There's guys like Petr Yan, there's guys like Ilia Topuria, there's guys like JDM, who I think is much better head movement, throws more fundamentally sound punches. But Adesanya's next, and I think still Adesanya's striking is overrated. And going into his fight with Sean Strickland, his rematch, I think that's the fight that's going to happen next. Some people probably think that Adesanya is going to get this one back, but I think his overrated striking is going to get exposed again by Sean Strickland. And it's mostly the fact that Adesanya just doesn't have good boxing, and he's not as defensively sound as some of these other strikers. And I think that's the big issue going into his fight with Sean Strickland, is that he's not going to be able to go on the front foot. I think Sean Strickland's going to put Adesanya on the back foot for the most part, and that's because I don't think Strickland's that afraid of getting hit by Adesanya, because he's able to defend himself most of the time and block the strikes. You can't say the same for Adesanya, and I think that's a big problem. Even with his most recent fight, his boxing defense, he mostly leans back when he's avoiding strikes, and now against these bigger, newer guys that he's fighting, they can actually catch him when he leans back. Robert Whittaker couldn't do that easily because he was shorter. Even Marvin Vettori, all these other guys, they had trouble matching the reach of Adesanya, but now that there's these bigger guys, I think his defense will struggle even more. Kamaru Usman. Okay, this one's a little bit different. I don't think many people are saying this, but I saw this one thing on, I think, ESPN MMA. I forgot the guy who said it. His name's Dean something. He was talking to Daniel Cormier, and he was saying that Islam Makhachev, if he beat JDM, would not put him to GOAT status, and a win over a guy like Usman would. And this goes for the people who think that fighters like Kamaru Usman, just based off of their track record, completely disregarding where Usman's at in his career right now, is a better win for Makhachev right now. That's complete bullshit. People like that are overrating the level of where Usman is at currently in his career. He is not the same Usman he was 3 years ago. And if we're being honest, his skill level, even in his prime, is not really up to par with these new welterweights, in my opinion. I think a prime Usman could still be champion in today's day, but I think it would be much harder. Remember, he was fighting guys like Colby Covington and Jorge Masvidal, and we have that guy saying that that would be a better win for Islam Makhachev right now, out of his prime Usman. But we have Charles Oliveira next, and I'm going to be honest, especially after this Ilia Topuria fight, I think the most overrated part of Charles Oliveira's game is his submission threat. And I feel like every time somebody goes down to the ground with Charles Oliveira, they say, you better watch out. This is completely dangerous. You don't want to be in his world. But when has Charles Oliveira ever submitted anybody high level off his back? Never. The only time he came close to one was against Arman Tsarukyan, but that wasn't even off of his back. So I think the most overrated part is, going into Charles Oliveira's world, and when you're on the ground with him, you're in trouble. I think Ilia Topuria and, Islam Makhachev have proved that you can take Charles Oliveira down and be on top, and Charles Oliveira will not come close to submitting you. I feel like in modern MMA now, nobody really gets submissions off of their back. But Max Holloway's next, and especially with his move up to 155, I think the most overrated part of Max Holloway is his chin. A lot of people say that he has the best chin in MMA. Let's be real, he was fighting featherweights, fighting guys like Volk, who notoriously just don't have that much knockout power. He's fought dangerous strikers like Yair and got tagged by them, but I still think there's a big difference between guys like Yair and Volk and guys like Charles Oliveira, guys like Dustin Poirier and Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria is kind of the exception because he fought at featherweight, but Ilia Topuria also just has next level knockout power. I think going up to 155 in any matchup Max Holloway has, I think his chin is just going to be normal like everybody else's. I don't think he's going to carry his iron chin. And a lot of people are going to blame it on his knockout loss against Topuria. I think regardless if he goes up, we even saw it against the Gaethje fight. He got knocked down in the Gaethje fight. And that's not to say he's not going to win these fights. I think Max Holloway is actually going to beat Dustin Poirier. I think he's a great striker. I just think that his chin isn't going to be an iron chin like it was at 45 because 55ers hit harder. But lastly, we have Sean O'Malley. And listen, I think it's the KO threat that people overrate. After this Merab fight, Sean O'Malley is not the guy that always has a chance of knocking you out. He has that touch of death. The striking threat of O'Malley just doesn't seem like that much of a threat anymore. And it's mostly because he's fighting a guy like Merab, who's just next level grappler. But going into Sean O'Malley's next fight, I don't think there should be as big of a narrative of Sean O'Malley can land that one shot and put you away, because now we're seeing more fighters that can avoid the striking of Sean O'Malley or even stay at range and then grapple him and completely subdue his striking and his knockout threat. A guy like Umar, I would confidently pick to beat O'Malley. Merab, obviously we know. And I think that KO dangerous striker part of O'Malley is slightly getting overrated now with his last performances.